Hi all, welcome to our first online lecture. Hope you'll enjoy learning this way and not using our class time for lecture, but for doing some more important things and maybe even getting out a little bit early. In this lecture, we're going to talk about just kind of an overview of assessment. What is it? And just get down to some of the basics. So if we're looking at a definition of assessment, there's really two or three parts to this. Assessment is the process of gathering information about children from several forms of evidence. And we're going to be talking this semester all about the different types of evidence that you can gather. So that's the first part. The second part is then organizing that information that you've gathered and interpreting it. That's the second part. So these two parts are very distinct, and as we go through talking about the different types of assessment, you'll see that always the analyzing and interpreting the information comes after gathering it. The third part really is how then are you going to use that information, and we'll actually talk about that too, and developing systems of assessments and that sort of thing. All of these different types of assessments that we'll be studying will actually form a system of assessment. And the components of an assessment system really should work together to provide a clear and accurate picture of what a child knows and what they're able to do, and maybe even why they behave the way they do. So it should give you some very good information about the children that you work with. There's several reasons why we assess young children, and the very first one is to monitor children's development and learning. This is really important. You use that information to make decisions about what and how you're going to be teaching, but also to report to parents, because you'll probably be conferencing with parents and telling them, giving them an evaluation of how their child is doing, but also when you're gathering evidence for IEPs or just for planning an evaluation for a child that you have concerns about. So monitoring development is one purpose of assessment. Another purpose is really to guide your curriculum planning, and this is very important and plays into that system of assessment that we'll talk about more later. You have to know what children know and what they don't know before you can plan your curriculum. That only makes sense, doesn't it, that we plan our curriculum based on what the group of children we have in our classroom are ready to learn and what they might be interested in before actually planning our curriculum. So that can be a new way of thinking for some people. I think most of us have experienced the top-down type of curriculum planning where I have a schedule and I'll stick to that schedule, and as a teacher I'm going to direct what the children are learning. But it's I think even more important to kind of come from the bottom up of understanding where the children are in the classroom. If I have a group of 5-year-olds that can already read, why would I teach letter recognition to them? Or if I have one child that already knows how to read, why would I be teaching letter recognition to that child? And also, if you can base your curriculum development on what you know the children are interested in, that particular group of children and what they're interested in, it's going to make learning so much more exciting for them. So curriculum planning is an important reason why we assess children. A third reason is that we want to be able to identify children who might benefit from special education services. So we might do screenings and evaluation of children during a referral process, during a multi-factor evaluation. There are a variety of assessments that are conducted in a number of different environments by specialists. So definitely we use assessment quite frequently in the special education service area. I mentioned it slightly, but also a purpose is to be able to report and communicate to parents, to directors, and specialists that you might be working with, that important evidence that's collected each day in the classroom, and be able to explain the assessment concepts and results that you have, and how you've interpreted assessment data that you've collected, and sharing that with others. Another thing that we will actually look at this semester is program evaluation, and that's another form of assessment. We use the Early Childhood Rating Scale, the ECHRS. You probably may have used the ELCO, which is the Early Literacy and Language Curriculum Observation. Maybe you've had some experience with the class. So these are all program evaluation tools that we talk about and practice with in our program here at NKU. So here are just some of the reasons why you want to assess children and environments. There are different principles of assessment also. One is to develop, that development is complex. That development is complex, it's multi-layered, and domains really do overlap. So all developmental domains are interrelated. So when you observe one activity, say the children are playing with blocks, the observations will cross over many different developmental domains. You may see cognitive development as children play with blocks. You may see mathematical development, such as balance and shape, taking place. You could also see physical development as children use their fine motor skills to build with the blocks. And you could see social development too, where children are interacting to build something together. So development really is complex, and understanding development is important. It's an important foundation for assessment. Family involvement is also very important for assessment. Parents know more about their children really than anyone else. Parents see their children in many different contexts, and this gives them a different perspective than those of you who are in the classroom or serving in another professional context with young children. And not only that, not only can parents provide a different type of perspective, but when parents feel their contributions are valued, they'll become more involved in the educational process. And so let me tell you about a little girl that when I worked at Head Start, she would not speak in the classroom, but her parents were able to tell us that yes, she spoke fine at home. She was being selectively mute in the classroom, and we were able to work with the parents to do some recording of her speech so that we could assess that and talk to them about it and just make sure that she was on track developmentally with that. Also, children should be assessed in natural context, so assessment should be developmentally appropriate. Environment and materials and activities and people all have a powerful impact on the outcome of assessment. So if children are not comfortable with the people they're with or the place that they're at, then assessment is probably not going to be very accurate. And that's why we always try to get to know children and get them comfortable with the classroom before we start the assessment process. Good assessment is also activity-based. Children should be involved in activities and with materials and playing as you're assessing them. Direct questioning very rarely works with young children and actually can cause them to become unresponsive and uncomfortable. And finally, and last principle of assessment is that assessment is an ongoing process. That's what we're primarily focusing on this class, ongoing assessment, that it It's done throughout the year. It informs curriculum and interventions that you might do with children. And the knowledge of children that you're teaching should influence what you teach. So it's going to influence your curriculum and how you teach that curriculum. A few guidelines for assessment. Well, the first one is that you really need to have permission from parents to do any type of assessment on young children. So a lot of times that permission is given when enrollment occurs. It's definitely something that you want to think about including in the enrollment process. But let's say there's a child that you have a concern about and you want to do a special type of screening with that child, well, then you're going to have to get special permission to do that. But generally speaking, parents and family members and guardians should be very aware of the type of assessment that you're doing in your classroom. The second thing is that you should be prepared. And that is sort of self-explanatory, but a lot of assessment doesn't occur on a daily basis because teachers aren't prepared. You have to think about, how am I going to collect data? Is it going to be on writing notes on Post-it notes, or am I going to have clipboards around the classroom that I can pick up and jot some things down that I see, and that sort of thing. So being prepared, knowing why you're doing the assessment and how you're going to do it is very important. We talked also about familiarity being important to a child. They need to be familiar with the environment. They need to be familiar with the person doing the assessment. In an ongoing assessment, that's generally not a problem because ongoing assessment occurs in the classroom with the teachers that are with the children on an everyday basis. We also have to think about adaptations for children with special needs. If a child is learning at a slightly slower rate, how will you assess them, and some special considerations that you may need to take for that child. But also a child that is learning at a higher and faster rate, and how are you going to assess those children? So we have to look at keeping in mind children that are not in sort of that norm range, but the ones that are above and below the normal range of development. I briefly mentioned before, but I want to go in a little more depth here, is that how important it is to know child development. You have to have a good understanding of development and developmental milestones that young children reach as they grow. Really, without that understanding, it's going to be hard to know what kind of assessment information you need to gather and how different sources of data can connect. So if you right now are unsure about development, you really should take the time to read and learn more. As you work with young children, you will come to know children and how the typical development more, but having a firm grounding and understanding of child development will allow you to make meaningful connections between what you observe and how children learn. So again, if you don't feel like you know child development, definitely keep some of those developmental checklists. The early childhood standards are written developmentally in chronological, how children develop. So those are another good source, but keeping in mind that also that you are learning on a daily basis about young children yourselves, and the more experience that you get working and observing young children, the more you're going to understand development. So generally, there's two different types of assessment. There's formal assessment, and formal assessment is basically standardized assessment. Every child is being assessed in the same way and on the same thing, and they're all asked the information in a standardized way. This could be in the form of a test or when we work with young children, it's usually a standardized procedure or standardized way of asking questions, such as asking all the children to complete the same activity in the same way with the same instructions in the same amount of time. So these are formal assessments. We do use formal assessments with young children, primarily screening and diagnostic assessments, which I'll get into in a minute. But there are a lot of problems with doing any kind of standardized testing with young children. They typically just don't respond well, and so the validity is not very high when we're using standardized testing with young children. So keep that in the back of your mind. Really, NAEYC does not recommend standardized testing for young children until after the age of 8. Now, that's violated all the time, but just FYI to keep in the back of your mind that sometimes that testing is not real valid with young children. I mean, one of the major reasons is because they don't read and write, but also that they can be very timid in different environments and settings, and it can kind of throw off the assessment process when we're talking about formal assessment. There are several different types of formal assessment. The first, and one that we use primarily with young children, is screening. Screening typically takes place once a year, and it's usually in the beginning of the school year after children have had about 6 to 8 weeks of time in the classroom, so that they're starting to get comfortable with the classroom environment and the teachers in the classroom. And screenings, really, all their purpose is to give us some basic information about children and if they are typically developing or if there are any red flags on development. And whether if there's a red flag in some area of development, should that child be referred for more testing? And then if they're referred for more testing, that type of testing is diagnostic testing. So let's say you have a child that you have a concern about, you do a screening on that child, it does red flags a couple of areas of development, let's say language, because that's always a big area, but in cognitive areas of development. And so you refer that child on to a school district for an evaluation, multi-factor evaluation. During the multi-factor evaluation, they're probably going to do some diagnostic testing. These are more standardized tests that are going to target specific areas of speech and cognitive development for that child. There's also achievement tests, and these are the MAPS tests and all the other different achievement tests that go on in primary schools. And then aptitude tests are also a type of formal assessment. Aptitude, just how well does a child do in a certain area. So that's formal assessment. We are not going to be talking about formal assessment in this class. I want to keep these ongoing assessment and formal assessment very separate from each other because everyone gets confused by the two. If you haven't already had it, you will have a class in screening. That's the focus is screening, and there you will learn all about formal assessment process. The other type of assessment is informal assessment, and that is what we're going to be talking about in this class, informal assessment. It's also known as authentic assessment. It's really an overarching term that's used to signify assessments that are conducted through real-life experiences that take place during play, group time, snack time, all those different times in the classroom. So informal assessment is what we're going to talk about when we're talking about ongoing assessment. It's the type of assessment that takes place during all those different times of day in the classroom. There's all different types of methods and ways to do informal assessment, and that's primarily what we're going to be looking at this semester. We're going to be looking at observation. We're going to be looking at checklists, portfolios, and performance assessments, documentation, rubrics, rating scales. All of these things we'll be looking at in much more depth. So if you can in your mind, take a picture of this slide, because this is what we're going to be looking at. But I want to make sure that you understand clearly that difference between formal and informal assessment. So there you are. That's kind of the down and dirty of assessment in early childhood. And we'll get into much more of the nitty-gritty a little bit later.